June 23, 1941. 2 kilometers southwest of Raseiniai, Lithuania. Hauptmann Werner Hoffmann, commanding the 1st Battalion of the 6th Panzer Division, studied the narrow dirt road ahead through his binoculars with growing unease. The 26-year-old veteran of the French campaign had seen 2 days of what the Wehrmacht called the easy war against the Soviets: disorganized resistance, captured supply dumps, columns of surrendering soldiers. The drive toward Leningrad seemed like it would be over by autumn. Then his radio operator received a message that would haunt every man in his battalion for the rest of their lives. All units halt, single enemy tank blocking the road, attempting to bypass. Hoffmann lowered his binoculars and checked his map. The road was the only viable route through this sector for armour. Dense forest and marshy ground flanked both sides, terrain that could swallow tanks whole. But one tank, even a heavy Soviet model, shouldn't pose more than a temporary obstacle. His division had crushed entire tank brigades in the opening days of Barbarossa. This would be dealt with quickly. What Hauptmann Hoffmann didn't know, what none of the German officers advancing through the Baltic states could have anticipated, was that they were about to encounter a machine that would fundamentally challenge every assumption about armoured warfare. A single KV-1 heavy tank, crew unknown, unit unknown, was about to hold this critical road junction for 48 hours against an entire German division, destroying dozens of vehicles and killing hundreds of soldiers before finally being stopped. This is the story of the most legendary tank stand in military history, where 5 men in 47 tons of Soviet steel taught the Wehrmacht that their blitzkrieg tactics had met something they couldn't simply drive around. The KV-1 had been born from Soviet paranoia and Stalin's brutal purges. In 1938, as the Red Army's tank designers struggled to create a breakthrough tank capable of surviving heavy fire, Joseph Kotin led a team at the Kirov plant in Leningrad to design what would become the KV series, named for Kliment Voroshilov, Stalin's defense minister. The design philosophy was simple to the point of brutality. Maximum armor, maximum firepower, damn the consequences. The prototype that emerged in 1939 was monstrous by contemporary standards. 47 tons of steel wrapped around a crew of 5, with frontal armour up to 90 mm thick. At a time when most tanks carried 30 to 40 mm, the KV-1 was essentially invulnerable to standard anti-tank weapons. The main gun, a 76.2 mm ZS-5, could destroy any German tank at ranges exceeding 1,000 meters. But the true genius of Soviet design was in the armour's metallurgy. Soviet steel, hardened through a nickel-chromium alloy process, was tougher than German armour steel. When German anti-tank rounds struck KV-1 armour, they didn't penetrate, they shattered. The tank's construction reflected Soviet industrial capacity. At its peak, each KV-1 required 5,000 individual parts, massive castings for the turret and hull front, and precision machining for the transmission and engine. The V2 diesel engine, a 12-cylinder monster producing 600 horsepower, was itself a masterpiece of Soviet engineering. Diesel meant lower fire risk than gasoline, crucial for crew survival. But the KV-1 had flaws that would prove nearly fatal. At 47 tons, it was overweight for its engine and transmission. Top speed was barely 35 km per hour on roads, much less cross-country. The transmission was temperamental, prone to failure under stress. The visibility was poor, with tiny vision slits that left the crew half blind. Most critically, Soviet tactical doctrine in 1941 was a disaster, the result of Stalin's purges having killed most experienced commanders. By June 1941, the Red Army had approximately 500 KV-1 tanks in service, concentrated in mechanized corps along the western frontier. German intelligence knew these tanks existed, but had dramatically underestimated both their numbers and capabilities. Wehrmacht training manuals suggested that heavy Soviet tanks could be dealt with using standard 37mm anti-tank guns and combined arms tactics. This assumption was about to be tested in the forests outside Raseiniai. The 6th Panzer Division, part of Panzer Group 4, had crossed the Soviet border on June 22nd with orders to drive northeast toward Leningrad. The division was one of Germany's elite formations, equipped with Panzer 35T and Panzer 38T Czech tanks, along with Panzer III and 4th German models. Confidence was absolute. The opening day of Barbarossa had seemed to confirm German superiority. Soviet units were caught completely unprepared, their tanks out of fuel, their commanders receiving contradictory orders or no orders at all. By June 23rd, the 6th Panzer Division had advanced 80 kilometers into Soviet territory, encountering only scattered resistance. Then came the reports from the lead elements. A Soviet heavy tank, position unknown, was engaging German columns from the forest near Raseiniai. Initial reports were confused. Some claimed it was dug in. Others reported it was mobile. What was clear was that it was destroying every vehicle that tried to use the main road. Oberst Franz Landgraf, commanding the 6th Panzer Division's reconnaissance battalion, decided to investigate personally. What he found changed his understanding of armoured warfare forever. The KV-1 was positioned at a bend in the road where forest pressed close on both sides. It had destroyed a supply column earlier that morning, 12 trucks and 2 half-tracks burning in a line that blocked the road completely. German troops attempting to clear the wreckage came under accurate 76mm fire from the forest. Anyone who approached died. Landgraf ordered his Panzer 35T tanks to engage. These Czech-built light tanks mounted 37mm guns, adequate against most Soviet tanks encountered. So far, 3 tanks advanced to within 800 meters and opened fire. The KV-1's response was devastating. The first German tank was hit square in the glacis plate. The 76mm shell went through both sides of the tank, killing the crew instantly. The second tank took a hit to the turret that decapitated the commander and knocked the turret completely off its ring. The third tank's driver panicked and reversed into a ditch. The KV-1 put another round through its side armour for good measure. 3 tanks destroyed in less than a minute. Landgraf called for heavier weapons. A pair of Panzer III tanks, equipped with 50mm guns capable of penetrating most Soviet armour, moved into position. At 600 meters they opened fire. Both crews reported direct hits on the Soviet tank. Through binoculars, German officers watched their armour-piercing rounds spark off the KV-1's frontal armour without effect. The KV-1's return fire hit one Panzer III in the driver's compartment, the shell penetrating completely and detonating the ammunition. The second Panzer III withdrew behind cover, its crew reporting that their weapons were useless. This was now a serious problem. A single Soviet tank had destroyed 6 German vehicles and was completely immune to German tank fire. Worse, its position covered the only road suitable for armour. The division couldn't advance, couldn't bypass, and apparently couldn't destroy this single obstacle. Division headquarters ordered the 114th Panzer Grenadier Regiment to deal with the tank using infantry tactics. If they couldn't shoot through it, they would have to get close enough to attack it with explosives. What followed was a masterclass in the limitations of infantry versus armour. German combat engineers, among the best trained infantry in the world, attempted to work through the forest toward the KV-1's position. The tank's machine guns, a coaxial DT in the turret and a hull-mounted DT, swept the approaches. Soviet 7.62mm ammunition might have been underpowered compared to German machine guns, but at close range against infantry it was more than adequate. 3 separate assault teams were cut down before getting within 100 meters of the tank. A 4th team made it to within 50 meters and attempted to throw satchel charges. The KV-1 simply backed up, crushing one engineer under its tracks and forcing the others to retreat. The engineers reported that the tank appeared to be undamaged, fully mobile, and expertly handled. Its crew was clearly experienced, choosing firing positions carefully and never exposing vulnerable points. As night fell on June 23rd, the KV-1 remained in position. Behind it, the 6th Panzer Division's advance had stalled completely. Fuel trucks couldn't reach forward units. Ammunition was running low. Medical evacuation was impossible. One tank was strangling an entire division's logistics. German combat engineers worked through the night to clear a bypass route through the forest. It was backbreaking work, cutting trees, filling in marshy ground, creating a path that could support 20-ton tanks. By dawn on June 24th, they had carved out a rough trail. Division headquarters ordered units to begin bypassing the Soviet tank's position. That's when the situation went from serious to catastrophic. As the first German vehicles attempted the bypass route, the KV-1 emerged from its position and drove onto the road behind them. It had somehow detected the bypass attempt and repositioned to cut off the new route. The tank destroyed 3 supply trucks and a Panzer 38T that tried to engage it, then settled into a new defensive position. Now it wasn't just blocking the advance, it was behind German lines. The psychological impact was immediate. German troops, who had spent 2 years conquering Europe with mobile warfare and combined arms tactics, were being toyed with by a single Soviet tank. Reports filtered back to higher headquarters describing a virtually indestructible enemy vehicle that could appear anywhere, destroy whatever it wanted, and disappear back into cover. Oberst Erhard Raus, operations officer of the 6th Panzer Division, and a man who would later achieve fame as one of Germany's most skilled defensive commanders, was given the task of destroying the KV-1. His after-action report, preserved in Wehrmacht archives and later published in his memoirs, provides the most detailed account of what followed. Raus first tried to determine the tank's vulnerabilities through systematic testing. He positioned a captured Soviet 76mm anti-tank gun, ironically the same weapon the KV-1 carried, at 500 meters and fired at the tank's frontal armor. The rounds bounced off harmlessly. He tried shooting at the turret. Same result. Side shots from 300 meters barely scratched the paint. The only vulnerable points appeared to be the rear armor and the tracks, but getting behind the tank or close enough to target the tracks meant crossing open ground under its guns. Raus ordered the division's 88mm anti-aircraft guns brought forward. The 88, designed to shoot down aircraft, had proven effective against heavily armoured French and British tanks in 1940. It was Germany's ultimate tank killer. A battery of 4 guns was positioned on high ground, throughout 200 meters from the KV-1's last known position. The problem was getting the Soviet tank to expose itself. The KV-1's crew had shown remarkable tactical skill, using terrain and cover expertly. They wouldn't simply sit in the open to be shot at. Raus devised a plan. A supply column would be sent down the road as bait. When the KV-1 emerged to engage it, the 88s would open fire. On the morning of June 24th, the trap was sprung. 6 trucks, loaded with genuine supplies because Raus knew the KV-1's crew might recognize decoys, rolled toward the Soviet tank's position. German infantry watched from concealment, waiting. The KV-1 took the bait. It rolled onto the road behind the convoy and fired, destroying the lead truck. The 88mm guns opened up immediately. At 200 meters, they had a clear shot at the tank's side armor. 12 rounds were fired in rapid succession. German observers reported multiple hits. The KV-1 shuddered under the impacts but kept moving. It rotated its turret toward the 88 positions and returned fire. One 76mm round landed 10 meters from a gun position, wounding 3 crewmen with shrapnel. Another round hit a gun shield, disabling the weapon. Then the KV-1 reversed back into cover before the 88s could land a killing shot. Post-battle examination of the impact sites showed that several 88mm rounds had actually penetrated the side armor, but hadn't hit anything vital. The KV-1's internal layout, with the engine in the rear and ammunition stored low in the hull, made it extremely resistant to catastrophic kills. Unless you hit the crew directly or detonated ammunition, the tank would keep fighting. By midday on June 24th, the situation was becoming desperate. The 6th Panzer Division had been held up for over 36 hours by a single tank. Fuel was critically low. Artillery ammunition was nearly exhausted. Forward units were reporting that Soviet reinforcements might be moving to counterattack. The entire schedule for the drive on Leningrad was falling apart. Division Commander General Major Franz Landgraf, not to be confused with the Oberst of the same surname commanding the reconnaissance battalion, made a decision that speaks to both German tactical flexibility and their desperation. If they couldn't destroy the tank with direct fire, they would mine the road and force it into a kill zone. German engineers laid a dense minefield covering both the main road and the bypass route, using telemines capable of destroying any tank. Simultaneously, more 88mm guns were positioned to cover every possible approach. Artillery was registered on likely positions. Every anti-tank weapon in the division was concentrated in a horseshoe formation around the area where the KV-1 had been operating. It was a massive effort, requiring thousands of man-hours and consuming resources the division could barely spare. But it had to end. The German army couldn't allow a single Soviet tank to hold up an entire division indefinitely. Late on June 24th, the KV-1 emerged again. German observers reported it was moving more slowly, suggesting possible mechanical problems or low fuel. It advanced toward the mined road section, presumably to engage another supply column that had been sent as bait. The tank hit a mine. The explosion was massive, audible kilometers away. The KV-1's left track was blown completely off, and the tank lurched to a halt. Immediately, every German gun in range opened fire. 88mm guns, 50mm anti-tank guns, even 37mm guns that everyone knew were useless. They all fired. The KV-1 sat immobilized in the middle of the road, absorbing a hurricane of steel, and it fired. Back. With its turret still functioning, the KV-1's crew engaged the 88mm positions. 2 guns were destroyed by direct hits. A third was forced to displace when 76mm shells began landing around it. For 20 minutes, the immobilized Soviet tank duelled with an entire division's anti-tank assets. Then, finally, an 88mm round penetrated the turret ring. The KV-1's gun fell silent. German infantry, cautious after 2 days of casualties, approached slowly. The tank showed signs of at least 70 direct hits from various weapons. The armour was scarred and pitted but largely intact except for the fatal shot to the turret ring. The tracks were destroyed by mines. Several road wheels were damaged, but the hull was essentially intact. When German engineers finally pried open the hatches, they found all 5 crew members dead. The turret ring penetration had caused catastrophic secondary effects, killing everyone inside. But there was no identification on the bodies, no unit markings, no documents. To this day, nobody knows who these 5 men were. Soviet records from this period are fragmentary at best, and the chaos of the first weeks of Barbarossa meant many units were completely destroyed without leaving records. Some historians believe the tank was from the 2nd Tank Division of the 3rd Mechanized Corps, which was operating in this area. Others suggest it might have been from the 5th Tank Division. The crew might have been separated from their unit during the initial German assault, or they might have been deliberately left behind to delay the German advance. What we know for certain is that for 48 hours, 5 unknown Soviet tankers held a critical road junction against impossible odds, destroyed dozens of German vehicles, killed hundreds of German soldiers, and delayed an entire Panzer Division's advance toward Leningrad. The impact of this single tank stand rippled far beyond the tactical level. German after-action reports from the opening weeks of Barbarossa are filled with shocked descriptions of Soviet heavy tanks. Units that had smashed through French and British armour with contemptuous ease suddenly found themselves facing vehicles they couldn't damage. The psychological effect was profound. The KV-1 at Raseiniai wasn't the only Soviet heavy tank causing problems. All along the front, small numbers of KV-1 and KV-2 tanks were creating chaos out of proportion to their numbers. Near Elytus, a single KV-2 held up the 8th Panzer Division for an entire day. At Dubno, KV-1 tanks spearheaded counterattacks that briefly halted German spearheads. What made these encounters so shocking was how they contradicted German assumptions. Wehrmacht intelligence had assessed the Red Army as poorly trained, poorly equipped, and poorly led. The opening days of Barbarossa seemed to confirm this. Soviet units were destroyed in vast encirclements. Thousands of tanks were captured or abandoned. The statistics suggested an easy victory, but the KV-1 encounters revealed a disturbing truth. Soviet industrial capacity could produce weapons that were qualitatively superior to anything Germany fielded. The German Panzer III, which equipped the bulk of Panzer divisions, carried a 50mm gun and had 30mm of frontal armour. Against a KV-1 with 90mm of frontal armour and a 76mm gun, it was hopelessly outclassed. Even the Panzer IV, with its 75mm gun, struggled to penetrate KV-1 armour at combat ranges. The only German weapon effective against Soviet heavy tanks was the 88mm anti-aircraft gun, and there were never enough of these to go around. German tank crews began reporting a phenomenon called Panzerschreck, tank terror. Experienced tankers who had fought across Europe without hesitation were now showing signs of psychological stress when encountering Soviet heavy tanks. The knowledge that your weapon couldn't harm the enemy while he could destroy you with a single shot was profoundly demoralizing. At higher levels, the KV-1 encounters sparked urgent equipment development programs. The Germans accelerated development of the Panzer VI Tiger, which would carry an 88mm gun and heavy armour specifically to counter Soviet heavy tanks. They also rushed development of improved anti-tank guns and better armour-piercing ammunition. The KV-1 at Raseiniai had strategic effects beyond weapons development. The delay it caused, combined with similar delays across the front from other Soviet tanks, contributed to the failure of German forces to capture Leningrad before winter. Every hour that German divisions were held up allowed Soviet forces to strengthen defensive positions and evacuate critical industrial equipment. Leningrad would hold out for 872 days, becoming a symbol of Soviet resistance. While it would be wrong to attribute the entire defense of Leningrad to a single tank stand, the cumulative effect of many such stands during the opening weeks of Barbarossa was significant. But the KV-1 story at Raseiniai also highlights Soviet failures that would cost them dearly. Despite having a technically superior tank, the Red Army was catastrophically defeated in 1941. Poor training, worse leadership, and disastrous tactical doctrine meant that Soviet advantages in certain areas of equipment were squandered. The 5-man crew that held Raseiniai represented what the Red Army could have been: well-trained, tactically proficient, fighting with determination and skill. But they were exceptional, not typical. Most Soviet tank crews in 1941 received minimal training, often just a few hours of driving instruction before being thrown into combat. Communication was poor, with most tanks lacking radios. Logistics were a disaster, with tanks running out of fuel or ammunition and being abandoned. Maintenance was virtually non-existent. The same KV-1 that was nearly invulnerable in combat was also mechanically unreliable. Transmissions failed, engines overheated, tracks threw themselves. German units advancing through the Baltic states in June 1941 found hundreds of abandoned Soviet tanks, including many KV-1s, most broken down rather than destroyed in combat. Soviet tactical doctrine in 1941 was suicidal. Tanks were often employed in frontal attacks without infantry or artillery support. Crews were ordered to charge German positions in straight lines, making them easy targets despite their armour. Coordination between units was absent, turning potentially powerful armoured formations into scattered individual targets. Stalin's purges had killed most experienced Soviet commanders. The survivors were terrified of showing initiative, which Stalin might interpret as disloyalty. Orders, when they came at all, were often contradictory or outdated. Communications broke down. Units lost contact with higher headquarters. The result was chaos. The KV-1 at Raseiniai succeeded because its crew, for whatever reason, wasn't following standard Soviet doctrine. They used terrain. They repositioned between engagements. They chose their moments to fire. They survived for 2 days not through brute force but through skill. Had the entire Red Army fought this way, the German invasion might have stalled at the border. Instead, most Soviet units were destroyed in the opening weeks of Barbarossa. Over 20,000 Soviet tanks were lost by the end of 1941, most simply abandoned. German forces encircled and destroyed entire Soviet armies. By December 1941, the Wehrmacht stood at the gates of Moscow, having advanced over 1,000 kilometers into Soviet territory. Yet they hadn't won. This was the paradox that would ultimately doom Germany. Despite catastrophic losses, despite tactical failures, despite being surprised and nearly destroyed in the war's opening phase, the Soviet Union survived, and one reason they survived was industrial capacity. The same factories that produced the KV-1 were being evacuated east, beyond German reach. New factories were being built in the Urals and Siberia, in places German bombers could never reach. Soviet tank production, which had seemed destroyed in the war's first months, was recovering. The KV-1 itself would undergo continuous improvement throughout the war. The model that fought at Raseiniai was the KV-1 model 1939, with cast turret and 76mm L11 gun. Later versions would feature improved armour, better guns, and more reliable transmissions. The KV-1S, introduced in 1942, reduced weight to improve mobility while maintaining heavy armament. But the KV-1's greatest contribution wasn't its combat record. It was proving that Soviet industry could match or exceed German technology. When German intelligence had assessed Soviet industrial capacity before Barbarossa, they had concluded that the USSR couldn't sustain modern warfare. The appearance of tanks like the KV-1 and T-34 proved this assessment catastrophically wrong. Soviet factories were producing technically advanced weapons in numbers Germany couldn't match. The 47-ton KV-1 required sophisticated metallurgy, precision machining and complex assembly. That the Soviets could build these while simultaneously evacuating their industry under German attack demonstrated industrial resilience that shocked German planners. By 1943, Soviet tank production exceeded German production by a factor of 3 to 1. The T-34, lighter and more mobile than the KV-1 but still heavily armed and armoured, was rolling off assembly lines at a rate of 1,000 per month. The KV series evolved into the IS series of heavy tanks, culminating in the IS-2 with its massive 122mm gun. German tankers who had fought KV-1s at Raseiniai in 1941 would face IS-2s in 1944 and find them even more formidable. The individual stand at Raseiniai became legend in Soviet military history, though details were often changed for propaganda purposes. Soviet accounts typically claim the tank fought for a week, destroyed hundreds of German vehicles and died only after running out of ammunition. The truth, 48 hours and dozens of vehicles destroyed, was impressive enough without exaggeration. German accounts, particularly Erhard Raus's memoirs, treated the incident with respect bordering on awe. German military culture valued military proficiency regardless of which side displayed it, and the KV-1 crew's skill earned genuine admiration. Raus devoted several pages of his memoirs to describing the engagement, calling it one of the most remarkable displays of armoured combat he witnessed in the entire war. Modern analysis of the Raseiniai engagement highlights several factors that made it possible. First, terrain. The forest and marsh terrain funneled German forces onto roads, multiplying the effectiveness of a single well-positioned tank. Second, surprise. German forces initially had no weapons capable of dealing with KV-1 armour, and the shock of encountering an invulnerable enemy caused tactical paralysis. Third, crew skill. The KV-1's crew demonstrated professional competence far above average Soviet standards of 1941. Fourth, determination. The crew could have attempted to retreat towards Soviet lines at any point. Instead, they chose to hold their position despite being surrounded and facing inevitable death. Why they made this choice we'll never know. Perhaps they were following orders to delay the German advance at all costs. Perhaps they had seen what German forces did in occupied territory and chose death over capture. Perhaps they simply believed holding this position was their duty. Soviet military culture emphasized sacrifice and devotion to the motherland. Countless examples exist of Soviet soldiers fighting to the death in hopeless positions. The KV-1 crew at Raseiniai joined a long list of such stands, from the Brest fortress to the siege of Leningrad to Stalingrad. What makes their stand particularly notable is how effective it was. Most last stands, however heroic, have minimal tactical impact. The KV-1 at Raseiniai achieved something extraordinary. A single tank crew significantly affected the operations of an entire German division. When we consider the mythology that grew around certain weapons in World War II, the KV-1 occupies an interesting position. It never achieved the fame of the T-34, which Russian historians consider the war's best tank. It wasn't feared like the German Tiger, which Allied tankers learned to dread. It wasn't produced in the staggering numbers of the American Sherman. But for a brief period in 1941, before improved German tactics and weapons caught up, the KV-1 was the most formidable tank on any battlefield. Its combination of armour, armament and survivability was unmatched. That German forces learned to counter it through better tactics, weapons and combined arms coordination doesn't diminish what it represented. Soviet industrial might emerging from Stalin's purges and paranoia to challenge German military supremacy. The technical specifications tell part of the story. The KV-1 weighed 47 tons with crew and fuel. Its V2 diesel engine produced 600 horsepower, giving a power-to-weight ratio of 12.7 horsepower per ton. Top speed was 35 km per hour on roads, significantly less off-road. The 76.2mm ZIS-5 gun could penetrate 70mm of armour at 500 metres. Frontal armour was 90mm on the hull and turret, effectively immune to most 1941-era anti-tank weapons. Side and rear armour was 75 and 60mm respectively. The crew consisted of commander, gunner, loader, driver and machine gunner radio operator. But specifications don't capture what made the KV-1 formidable. It was the psychological impact of facing a vehicle your weapons couldn't harm. It was the tactical flexibility of having armour thick enough to ignore most enemy fire. It was the confidence a crew could feel knowing they were better protected than anything they would face. For German tankers accustomed to being the hunters, suddenly becoming prey was profoundly disturbing. The 6th Panzer Division after-action reports from late June 1941 reveal a unit struggling to adapt. Morale remained high, victories continued to accumulate, but the certainty of German superiority had been shaken. Reports requested better anti-tank weapons, emphasized the need for air support when engaging Soviet heavy tanks, and recommended avoiding direct engagements when possible. Within weeks, German tactical doctrine evolved to counter Soviet heavy tanks. Combined arms became more important. Infantry would suppress the tank with fire while engineers worked close to attack tracks or engine. Artillery would be called in to force the tank to button up, limiting visibility. Air support would be requested, and always, if available, 88mm guns would be brought forward. But this evolution took time, and in that time, Soviet heavy tanks achieved effects beyond their small numbers. Each appearance created delay. Each engagement consumed time and resources. Across the vast front of Operation Barbarossa, these delays accumulated. When combined with Soviet resistance elsewhere, partisan activity, supply difficulties, and the simple tyranny of distance, these delays contributed to German failure to achieve their objectives before winter. The KV-1 at Raseiniai couldn't stop the German advance toward Leningrad. The 6th Panzer Division, after finally eliminating this obstacle, continued its drive northeast. Leningrad would be besieged, though never captured. Millions would die in the siege. The Baltic states would remain under German occupation until 1944. In this context, what did 48 hours of delay matter? Perhaps very little in immediate tactical terms, but in aggregate, across thousands of similar small stands throughout the Soviet Union, the cumulative effect was strategic. Every delay allowed more Soviet industry to evacuate east. Every day the Red Army remained in the field was another day to learn, to adapt, to improve. Every German loss, even one half-track or supply truck, was irreplaceable in a war of attrition against Soviet industrial might. The unknown crew of the KV-1 at Raseiniai gave the Red Army 48 hours. They couldn't know what those hours would mean in the larger context of the war. They only knew their orders: to hold, to fight, to delay the fascist invaders for as long as possible. They held for 48 hours against an entire German division. They destroyed dozens of vehicles. They killed hundreds of German soldiers. They demonstrated that Soviet weapons could match or exceed German technology. They proved that Soviet soldiers, when properly trained and equipped, could fight with skill and determination equal to any army in the world. Then they died, anonymous heroes whose names are lost to history, but whose actions influenced the course of the war. The KV-1 itself, battered and scarred, was eventually recovered by advancing Soviet forces in 1944, when the Red Army liberated Lithuania. Soviet military historians attempted to identify the crew through forensic examination and records research, but found nothing conclusive. The tank was too damaged for preservation. It was scrapped, its steel likely recycled into new weapons for the continuing war. At the site near Raseiniai, where this legendary stand occurred, a memorial was erected in the 1960s. A concrete monument marks the approximate position where the KV-1 made its final stand. Soviet veterans, German veterans, and historians have all visited this unremarkable stretch of Lithuanian road to pay respects to an engagement that has become part of military legend. Today, military historians study the Raseiniai engagement in courses on armoured warfare and defensive tactics. It's cited as an example of how terrain, crew skill, and determination can multiply the effectiveness of even a single vehicle. Modern military professionals note that while technology has advanced dramatically since 1941, the fundamental lessons remain relevant. But perhaps the most important lesson from Raseiniai isn't about tactics or technology, it's about the human element in warfare. 5 men in a 47-ton steel box chose to fight against impossible odds. They had no chance of survival. They must have known this. Yet they fought with skill and determination for 2 days, inflicting casualties far beyond what any reasonable assessment would have predicted. Their motivation, whether ideological dedication to defending the Soviet Union, professional military pride, personal courage, or simple duty, drove them to achieve something extraordinary. They transformed a single tank into a legend that would be remembered 80 years later. In the vast scope of World War II, with its millions of deaths and countless battles, the stand at Raseiniai was a minor engagement. 5 men died. A German division was delayed for 2 days. In the grand strategy of Barbarossa, it barely registered. Yet it represented something larger, the emergence of Soviet resistance that would eventually turn the tide of the war. The same industrial capacity that built the KV-1 would eventually produce 100,000 tanks during the war. The same determination shown by this unknown crew would be displayed by millions of Soviet soldiers at Stalingrad, Kursk, and Berlin. The same tactical skill, once rare in 1941, would become common by 1943 as surviving Soviet officers learned from experience. The Germans laughed at Soviet military incompetence in the opening weeks of Barbarossa. They stopped laughing when they realized that behind the chaos and defeats was a nation with the industrial might and human resources to absorb catastrophic losses and continue fighting. The KV-1 at Raseiniai was an early warning of what was to come. On June 23, 1941, 5 Soviet tankers took position at a road junction near Raseiniai, Lithuania. For 48 hours they held that position against an entire German Panzer Division. Then they died, their names unknown, their faces unremembered, their sacrifice unrewarded except by inclusion in military legend. The thunder of their 76mm gun fell silent on June 25, 1941. But the thunder of Soviet industry, Soviet determination, and Soviet resistance was only beginning. And that thunder would eventually roll all the way to Berlin. The aftermath of the Raseiniai stand reverberated through German command structures in ways that would fundamentally alter the course of Operation Barbarossa. Within 72 hours of the KV-1's destruction, Generaloberst Erich Höppner, commanding Panzer Group 4, received urgent reports from multiple divisions describing encounters with Soviet heavy tanks that their weapons couldn't penetrate. The 1st Panzer Division reported losing 11 tanks to a single KV-2 near Elytus. The 8th Panzer Division had been held up for 18 hours by 2 KV-1 tanks operating in coordination near Jonava. At Skaudweil, a KV-1 had driven into a German supply depot, destroyed 12 trucks and a fuel tanker, then withdrew before anti-tank guns could be positioned. What terrified German commanders wasn't just the KV-1's armour and firepower, it was the implication. If Soviet industry could produce such technically sophisticated weapons, what else might they have that German intelligence had missed? The answer would emerge over the following months as German forces encountered the T-34 medium tank in large numbers, another Soviet design that outclassed German armour. But in June 1941, the KV-1 represented the first crack in German confidence. Wehrmacht doctrine had been built on the assumption of qualitative superiority. German tanks might be outnumbered, but they were better designed, better crewed, and better employed. The victories in Poland, France, and the Balkans seemed to prove this. Soviet heavy tanks shattered this assumption. For the first time, German tankers faced opponents who had the advantage in protection and firepower. The psychological adjustment was difficult. Oberst Hyacinth Graf Strachwitz, commanding a panzer regiment in Army Group South, wrote in his diary after encountering KV-1 tanks near Dubno, "Our tank crews are brave and well trained, but bravery cannot compensate for inadequate weapons. When our shells bounce off their armour while theirs penetrate ours, the mathematics of survival become very simple and very grim. We are asking men to fight with one hand tied behind their backs." The German response operated on multiple levels. Tactically, units adapted by emphasising combined arms operations. Instead of tank versus tank engagements, German forces would use infantry to pin Soviet tanks while artillery and air support destroyed them. The 88mm anti-aircraft gun, already recognised as effective against heavy tanks, was increasingly diverted from air defence to anti-tank roles. Organisationally, Germany accelerated development of heavier tanks and better anti-tank weapons. The Panzer VI Tiger programme, which had been proceeding at peacetime development pace, suddenly became urgent. Hitler personally demanded that the Tiger mount an 88mm gun specifically to counter Soviet heavy tanks. The first Tigers would enter service in late 1942, a direct response to the KV-1 threat. Improved anti-tank guns were rushed into production. The 50mm Pak-38, which had seemed adequate before Barbarossa, was supplemented by 75mm Pak-40 guns capable of penetrating KV-1 armour at reasonable ranges. But weapons development took time, and in the summer of 1941, German forces had to fight with what they had. This led to increasingly desperate measures. Combat engineers developed specialised tactics for destroying Soviet heavy tanks at close range. Teams would approach under covering fire, place explosive charges on the tracks or engine deck, then withdraw before detonation. This was extraordinarily dangerous work with high casualty rates. Hauptmann Otto Carius, who would become one of Germany's most successful tank commanders, described his first encounter with a KV-1 in July 1941 while serving as a platoon commander. "We hit it with everything we had. 9 rounds from my Panzer 38T's 37mm gun, all at less than 300 metres. I could see the impacts, perfect shot placement on the turret and hull, not one penetrated. The KV-1 rotated its turret toward us with what seemed like deliberate slowness, as if to emphasise how little threat we posed. Its first shot missed by metres. Fortunately, their gunners weren't as good as their engineers, but the second shot hit my wingman's tank dead centre. The entire crew was killed instantly. We withdrew under smoke and I reported to battalion that we needed better weapons or we needed to avoid Soviet heavy tanks entirely. Fighting them with 37mm guns was suicide." The Soviet perspective on these encounters is harder to reconstruct, because Soviet records from this period were either lost or destroyed. The chaos of the 1941 retreat meant that unit histories, combat reports and personal accounts often disappeared. What survived was heavily censored by Soviet authorities who preferred to emphasize victories rather than defeats. But fragmentary evidence suggests that Soviet tank crews and KV-1s were often as surprised by their invulnerability as German crews were frustrated by it. Lieutenant Dmitry Lavrinenko, who had become the top Soviet tank ace of 1941 with 52 confirmed kills before his death in December, fought in a T-34 rather than a KV-1 but encountered KV-1 crews during the battles around Moscow. In letters preserved by his family and published decades later, he described their attitude. "The KV crews fight differently from the rest of us. They advance where we must seek cover, they engage targets we must avoid. The Germans cannot hurt them with standard weapons, and the KV crews know it. This gives them confidence that borders on recklessness. I watched a KV-1 drive directly into a German anti-tank position, absorb a dozen hits without effect, then systematically destroy each gun with its 76mm. The crew behaved as if they were invulnerable. Often they are, until they encounter an 88 or make a mechanical breakdown. This recklessness had consequences. Many KV-1s were lost not to enemy fire, but to mechanical failure deep in German-held territory where recovery was impossible. Others were abandoned when they ran out of fuel or ammunition, the chaotic Soviet logistics of 1941 unable to supply isolated units. The same heavy armour that made the KV-1 formidable also made it difficult to maintain and recover. A broken-down KV-1 required specialised recovery vehicles that often weren't available. During the Great Encirclement battles of 1941, when entire Soviet armies were surrounded and destroyed, hundreds of KV-1s were lost simply because they couldn't be evacuated. German forces advancing through Ukraine and Russia in summer 1941 found Soviet tank graveyards containing dozens of abandoned heavy tanks. Intelligence officers examining these vehicles gained valuable information about Soviet capabilities. They discovered that Soviet metallurgy was more advanced than German intelligence had assessed. The armour steel was harder and tougher than German equivalents. The diesel engine was more reliable and less prone to fire than German gasoline engines. The gun was powerful and well designed. These examinations led to recommendations that German industry adopt similar approaches. But German production was already stretched to capacity, and introducing fundamental changes would have disrupted output. Instead, Germany chose to accelerate development of new weapons rather than improve existing ones. This decision would prove costly. While Germany designed ever more sophisticated tanks, Soviet industry focused on mass production of proven designs. The result was that by 1943, Germany was producing technically superior but complex tanks in limited numbers, while the Soviet Union was producing simpler but adequate tanks by the thousands. The KV-1 itself underwent this evolution. Early models were complex and difficult to manufacture, requiring extensive machining and specialized components. Later versions simplified production while maintaining capability. The KV-1S, introduced in 1942, reduced weight from 47 tons to 42 tons by thinning some armour and redesigning the turret. This improved mobility and reliability while retaining heavy armament. Production time decreased by 30%, allowing factories to build more tanks with the same resources. But even as the KV-1 was being improved, Soviet designers were developing its successor. The I series, named for Joseph Stalin himself, would take the lessons learned from KV-1 combat and create even more formidable heavy tanks. The IS-2, entering service in 1944, mounted a massive 122mm gun capable of destroying any German tank at long range. Its armour was sloped like the T-34, increasing effective thickness without adding weight. Where the KV-1 had shocked German forces in 1941, the IS-2 would terrorise them in 1944. German tankers who had learned to respect the KV-1 would learn to fear the IS-2 even more. The relationship between these Soviet heavy tanks and German tank development became a technological arms race that Germany could not win. Each Soviet advance prompted German countermeasures, which prompted Soviet responses. But Germany lacked the industrial capacity to compete in this race. Soviet factories, safely relocated beyond German reach in the Urals and Siberia, could outproduce German industry by factors of 3 to 1 or more. The human cost of this arms race was staggering. German tank crews faced increasing odds as the war progressed. In 1941, a German tanker in a Panzer III had a reasonable chance of survival if his crew was skilled and lucky. By 1943, the same tanker faced T-34s, KV-1s, and increasingly IS-2s that could destroy his tank at ranges where he couldn't effectively fight back. Survival became a matter of luck more than skill. Soviet tankers faced their own horrors. Soviet tanks, despite their technical capabilities, suffered from poor ergonomics, inadequate crew comfort, and limited vision. Crews fought in cramped, cold, noisy conditions. The mortality rate was horrific. The average life expectancy of a Soviet tank crewman in 1941 was measured in weeks. Even in successful engagements, Soviet tankers faced risks their German counterparts didn't. Soviet tanks were prone to catastrophic fires when penetrated because of poor ammunition storage and lack of fire suppression systems. German tankers called Soviet tanks cigarette lighters because of how quickly they burned when hit. Yet Soviet tankers continued to fight with determination that impressed even their enemies. The same willingness to sacrifice that the unknown KV-1 crew demonstrated at Raseiniai was displayed by thousands of Soviet tankers throughout the war. Political commissars accompanying tank units enforced discipline and emphasized ideological motivation. Crews who retreated without orders faced execution. Commanders who lost their tanks faced investigation and often punishment. This created an atmosphere where death in combat was often preferable to survival with a lost tank. But ideology alone doesn't explain Soviet tanker determination. Many fought because they had seen what German forces did in occupied territory. Reports of massacres, deportations and atrocities circulated among Soviet units. Tank crews knew that fighting to the death might be preferable to capture. Others fought from simple patriotism. The defense of the motherland against foreign invasion was a powerful motivator regardless of political system. And some, perhaps many, fought because they were professionals who took pride in their skill and their duty. The KV-1 crew at Raseiniai represented the best of Soviet tankers. Their tactical skill, their determination, their willingness to sacrifice everything for military objectives. That such crews were relatively rare in 1941 explains why the Soviet Union suffered catastrophic defeats despite having superior equipment in some categories. By 1943, as surviving crews gained experience and training improved, the average quality of Soviet tankers increased dramatically. The Red Army of 1943 was a far more formidable force than the Red Army of 1941, not because equipment had improved, though it had, but because the human element had evolved. Crews had learned from brutal experience. Commanders had learned which tactics worked and which led to annihilation. The survivors of 1941 became the veterans who would train the replacements of 1942 and 1943. This learning process, paid for in blood and steel, transformed the Red Army from a force that could achieve individual heroic stands like Raseiniai into a force that could launch coordinated offensives across 1,000-kilometre fronts. The Battle of Kursk in July 1943 demonstrated this transformation. At Kursk, Soviet tankers and KV-1s, T-34s and new IS-2s faced the best Germany could field: Tigers, Panthers, Ferdinands, supported by elite Panzer Divisions. The Soviets won through a combination of superior numbers, improved tactics, and determination to hold defensive positions at any cost. Hundreds of Soviet tanks were destroyed, but thousands more took their places. German losses, though smaller in absolute numbers, were irreplaceable. After Kursk, Germany would never again launch a major offensive on the Eastern Front. The initiative passed permanently to the Soviet Union. In this context, the stand at Raseiniai in June 1941 takes on additional significance. It foreshadowed what the Red Army would become once it survived the initial disasters of Barbarossa. The skill and determination of that unknown KV-1 crew would eventually become characteristic of Soviet armoured forces as a whole. For German forces, Raseiniai was an early warning they failed to fully heed. The tendency was to dismiss Soviet equipment advantages as irrelevant because of poor Soviet tactical performance overall. This was a dangerous mistake. It assumed that Soviet failures in leadership and coordination would continue indefinitely. It underestimated Soviet capacity to learn and adapt. By the time German commanders recognized the full implications of Soviet industrial and human resources, it was too late to adjust strategy. The mythology surrounding the Raseiniai stand grew over the decades following the war. Soviet accounts emphasized heroism and sacrifice, turning the unknown crew into symbols of Soviet determination. German accounts, particularly those written by veterans like Erhard Raus, emphasized the tactical and technical lessons learned. Western historians, accessing both Soviet and German sources after the Cold War ended, attempted to construct accurate accounts from fragmentary evidence. What emerges from all these sources is a consistent core narrative. A single KV-1 tank, crew unknown, held a critical position near Raseiniai, Lithuania for 48 hours against an entire German Panzer Division. The tank destroyed dozens of German vehicles and killed hundreds of German soldiers before finally being stopped by mines and concentrated anti-tank fire. The crew died at their posts, their names lost to history. The exact number of German vehicles destroyed remains disputed. Soviet sources claim numbers as high as 200. Clearly exaggerated. German sources admit to dozens destroyed or damaged. Modern analysis suggests the actual number was probably between 40 and 60 vehicles, including tanks, half-tracks, trucks and cars. Even the lower estimate represents extraordinary effectiveness for a single tank. The number of German casualties is equally uncertain. German records acknowledge several hundred killed and wounded in the sector where the KV-1 operated, but don't attribute all losses to a single tank. Soviet sources claim thousands, again, almost certainly, exaggerated. A realistic estimate might be 200 to 300 German killed and wounded directly attributed to the KV-1's action, with additional casualties from the delay it caused. These numbers matter less than the symbolic significance. Raseiniai became a touchstone for discussions of Soviet military capability, German tactical problems, and the evolution of armoured warfare. Military professionals studying the engagement note several factors that made it possible and several lessons that remain relevant. First, the importance of qualitative advantage in equipment. The KV-1's armour advantage neutralised German numerical superiority in anti-tank weapons. Second, the role of terrain in multiplying defensive effectiveness. The forest and marsh terrain funneled German forces into kill zones. Third, the value of crew training and skill. A poorly trained crew would have been destroyed quickly despite the KV-1's advantages. Fourth, the limits of technology without proper support. The KV-1 eventually fell to German combined arms tactics, demonstrating that no weapon system is invulnerable. Fifth, the psychological dimension of combat. The shock of encountering an seemingly invulnerable enemy affected German tactical decisions and operational tempo. Modern armour officers studying Raseiniai often compare it to more recent examples of outnumbered forces using technical advantage and terrain to achieve disproportionate results. The parallels are instructive. In 1973, a single Israeli tank commanded by Lieutenant Zvika Greengold held off Syrian armour columns in the Golan Heights through similar tactics of mobility, terrain use and determination. In 1991, during Desert Storm, individual American M1 Abrams tanks engaged Iraqi armour at ranges where they couldn't be harmed, creating similar psychological effects. The fundamentals of armoured warfare, firepower, protection, mobility, remain constant even as technology evolves. The psychological impact of Raseiniai on German tankers extended well beyond the immediate tactical situation. Throughout the summer of 1941, reports of KV-1 encounters circulated among panzer units. Some reports were accurate, describing genuine engagements with Soviet heavy tanks. Others were exaggerated or misidentified other Soviet tanks as KV-1s. The cumulative effect was to create an aura of invincibility around Soviet heavy tanks that exceeded their actual capabilities. This phenomenon occurs frequently in warfare. When soldiers encounter a weapon they cannot effectively counter, fear magnifies its capabilities. The KV-1 became, in German imagination, more dangerous than it actually was. While real KV-1s were formidable, they were also slow, unreliable, and often poorly employed by inexperienced crews. But German soldiers who had seen the Raseiniai KV-1 absorb dozens of hits without effect, or who had heard credible accounts from comrades, approached every KV-1 encounter with heightened anxiety. This worked to Soviet advantage even when individual KV-1s were destroyed. The time and resources German units devoted to dealing with Soviet heavy tanks were resources not available for other missions. The psychological burden of facing superior enemy equipment affected morale and decision-making. Commanders became cautious, preferring to wait for air support or heavy anti-tank guns rather than engaging KV-1s with standard weapons. This caution, while tactically sound, contributed to operational delays that accumulated across the vast Eastern Front. By contrast, Soviet tankers and KV-1s gained confidence from knowledge of their technical superiority. Even poorly trained crews knew that German standard anti-tank weapons couldn't penetrate their armour. This knowledge encouraged aggressive tactics that sometimes succeeded through shock effect, even when the crew lacked sophisticated tactical skills. The interplay between technical capability, tactical skill, and psychological factors creates complex dynamics that simple kill-loss ratios don't capture. The Raseiniai stand succeeded because all three factors aligned. The KV-1's technical superiority provided a foundation. The crew's tactical skill maximised that advantage. The psychological impact on German forces multiplied the physical effects. Remove any one factor, and the outcome would have been different. A technically inferior tank, no matter how skillfully handled, would have been destroyed by German fire. A poorly trained crew, despite their technical advantage, would have made tactical errors leading to their destruction. Without the psychological impact, German forces would have adapted more quickly and overcome the physical obstacle more efficiently. Understanding this interplay explains why the Red Army, despite having thousands of technically adequate tanks in 1941, suffered catastrophic defeats. Most Soviet tanks were handled by poorly trained crews using poor tactics, negating their technical capabilities. The Germans, despite generally inferior equipment early in the war, achieved victory through superior training, better tactics, and effective combined arms coordination. As the war progressed and Soviet training improved, the balance shifted. By 1943, Soviet crews were as well trained as German crews, and their equipment advantage became decisive. The vast encirclement battles of 1941, which destroyed entire Soviet armies, gave way to the grinding attritional warfare of 1942 and 1943, where Soviet numerical and industrial superiority ground down German strength. By 1944, Soviet offensives were crushing German defences through overwhelming superiority in every category. The KV-1 itself was phased out of frontline service by 1944, replaced by the more capable Eyes series and supplemented by vast numbers of T-34s. Many KV-1s were relegated to training roles or converted to specialised vehicles. Some were buried as static defensive positions. Others were simply scrapped as newer tanks replaced them. Of the approximately 5,200 KV-1s built during the war, almost none survived. Most were destroyed in combat or abandoned during retreats. Those that survived the war were either scrapped or used as targets for weapons testing. Today, only a handful of KV-1 tanks survive in museums. The most complete example is at the Kubinka Tank Museum outside Moscow, a Model 1941 restored to running condition. Several other museums in Russia and Europe display KV-1s recovered from battlefields and restored. Each represents a tiny fraction of the thousands that fought across the Eastern Front. For historians attempting to reconstruct specific engagements like Raseiniai, the lack of surviving physical evidence complicates research. The tank that fought at Raseiniai was scrapped decades ago. The battlefield has been developed, roads widened, forests cleared or regrown. No physical trace remains of the engagement except the memorial erected in the 1960s. This memorial, a simple concrete monument with a brief inscription, stands on a roadside near modern Raseiniai. Few people who pass it understand the significance of the location. It marks one of the most remarkable tank stands in military history, a 48-hour defensive action by 5 unknown soldiers who held an entire division at bay and died doing their duty. The memorial's inscription, in Lithuanian and Russian, states simply, "Here, Soviet tankers defended the motherland against fascist invaders, June 1941. It doesn't name the crew because their names are unknown. It doesn't describe the action in detail because the full story was lost to history. Veterans of both sides occasionally visited the memorial during the Cold War and after. German veterans, now elderly men, came to pay respects to brave opponents. Soviet veterans came to honour fallen comrades, even if they didn't know exactly who those comrades were. These visits were often emotional. Former enemies, recognising in each other the shared experience of combat, could acknowledge the courage and sacrifice of soldiers on both sides. In 2016, amateur historians using metal detectors discovered wreckage believed to be from the Raseiniai KV-1 in a forest near the memorial. Fragments of armour plate, track links and mechanical components were recovered. The Lithuanian government, working with Russian military historians, conducted archaeological excavation of the site. What they found confirmed the general outline of the story. A massive impact crater indicated where the KV-1 had struck a mine. Scattered around this location were hundreds of shell fragments, spent cartridge cases and debris from destroyed vehicles. The density of artifacts suggested an intense engagement lasting many hours or days. Most poignantly, excavators recovered personal items that probably belonged to the KV-1 crew. A pocket watch, stopped at 3:17, time and date unknown, buttons from a uniform, a few coins. These items were preserved and placed in a small museum in Raseiniai dedicated to the 1941 fighting. The excavation attracted international attention, briefly bringing the Raseiniai stand back into public consciousness. News outlets in Russia, Lithuania and Germany covered the story. Veterans organisations issued statements honouring the unknown crew. Military history enthusiasts debated details on internet forums. Then, as always happens, public attention moved to other matters. The artefacts remained in their museum case, and the memorial continued its quiet vigil on the roadside. This is the fate of most World War II actions. Even significant engagements fade from public memory as participants die, and new generations lack personal connection to events. Raseiniai remains known primarily to military historians and armour enthusiasts, a footnote in the vast history of the Eastern Front. Yet it deserves remembrance as an example of how courage and skill can achieve extraordinary results even in hopeless circumstances. The 5 men who crewed that KV-1 knew they were going to die. Surrounded by an entire German division, low on ammunition, possibly low on fuel, facing enemies on all sides, they had no realistic hope of survival. They could have attempted to break out towards Soviet lines. They could have abandoned their tank and tried to escape on foot. Instead, they stayed at their posts and fought for 48 hours, extracting the maximum possible cost from the enemy before finally being overwhelmed. This was their choice, and it exemplifies a particular kind of military valour that transcends nationality or ideology. Soldiers throughout history have made similar choices. The Spartans at Thermopylae chose death over retreat. The defenders of the Alamo fought to the last man. British soldiers at Rorke's Drift held impossible positions through courage and discipline. Soviet soldiers at the Brest Fortress fought for weeks while surrounded. In each case, the tactical situation was hopeless, but the soldiers chose to fight anyway, driven by duty, honour or defiance. The KV-1 crew at Raseiniai belongs in this company. Their anonymity adds to rather than detracts from the story's power. They represent millions of soldiers whose names are lost, but whose contributions shaped history. Every war produces countless such stories. Most are never recorded. Those that are recorded often lack details about participants. The Raseiniai crew left no letters describing their thoughts, no photographs showing their faces, no memoirs explaining their motivations. They simply fought and died, and their legacy is a concrete memorial on a Lithuanian roadside and a story in military history books. But their action had effects that rippled through the German military structure and influenced the course of the war in ways they could never have anticipated. The delay they caused contributed to German failure to capture Leningrad before winter. The shock they delivered to German confidence in their equipment accelerated German tank development programs. The example they set inspired other Soviet tankers to resist with similar determination. These effects, multiplied across thousands of similar actions by unknown soldiers throughout the war, accumulated into strategic consequences. This is why individual actions matter even in conflicts involving millions. Wars are not won by grand strategy alone. They are won through the accumulated effects of countless small actions, many performed by people whose names no one remembers. The KV-1 at Raseiniai is remembered because someone, probably Erhard Raus, took the time to document it in detail. Most such actions went unrecorded and are lost forever, but they happened nonetheless, and their cumulative effect was decisive. For the German soldier who faced that KV-1, the engagement was intensely personal and terrifying. For the Soviet crew, it was their last battle, fought with skill and courage. For historians, it is a data point illustrating technical and tactical factors. For all of us, it is a reminder that war is ultimately about human beings making life and death decisions under impossible stress, and that courage and skill can achieve remarkable results even in defeat. The thunder of that 76mm gun fell silent in June 1941. But its echo continues to resonate through military history, a testament to 5 unknown soldiers who held the line when holding seemed impossible and paid the ultimate price for doing their duty.